In the dim, flickering light of the old hospital, Michael Carter had just started his shift as a nurse. The building was slated for closure in a few months, its halls already echoing with the weight of decades of neglect. The corridors were lined with peeling wallpaper and faded signs, casting an eerie, almost melancholic atmosphere. As Michael walked through the deserted halls, the silence was occasionally broken by the distant clang of metal and the whisper of old, malfunctioning machinery. Michael had heard stories about the hospital's dark past, unsubstantiated rumors that spoke of unethical experiments and ghostly apparitions. He had dismissed them as mere folklore, the kind of tales that become embellished over years of retelling. Yet, as he settled into his new role, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate the air. It started subtly. At first, it was just the occasional whisper, a sound so faint it could easily be mistaken for the creaking of the building. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from the direction of the abandoned wing, a part of the hospital that had been sealed off for as long as anyone could remember. The wing had been shut down following a series of unexplained incidents that led to its abandonment, and the key had long been lost or discarded. One evening, as Michael made his rounds, the whispers grew louder, morphing into muffled cries and distant screams. The sound seemed to pierce the quiet of the night, reverberating off the walls with an unsettling clarity. Michael's curiosity got the better of him. The noises were unbearable, as if the walls themselves were crying out for help. He decided he needed to investigate. He approached the sealed-off wing with a sense of dread, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The door to the abandoned section was heavy and rusted, its surface marred by years of disuse. Michael hesitated for a moment, but the sounds of anguish seemed to beckon him, urging him to uncover the source of the torment. With a deep breath, Michael pried the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the door creaked slowly, revealing a narrow, dark corridor. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying with it a faint odor of decay. Michael's flashlight beam pierced through the darkness, illuminating old, discarded medical equipment and tattered files scattered across the floor. The walls were lined with old, rusting metal shelves and faded medical charts. As Michael ventured further down the corridor, the whispers grew louder, becoming almost deafening. The sound seemed to come from behind a closed door at the end of the hall. His heart raced as he approached the door, which was labeled with a faded sign reading, "Experimental Procedures, Authorized Personnel Only." The door was slightly ajar, and Michael could see a sliver of darkness beyond it. Pushing the door open, Michael was met with a room that had been left almost as it was when it was last used. The air was thick with dust, and the room was filled with old medical equipment, scalpels, syringes, and strange apparatuses whose functions he could only guess at. In the center of the room stood a large, metal operating table, its surface stained and tarnished. The whispers in the room grew frantic, and Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. He noticed a series of old medical records and journals scattered on a table. As he flipped through them, his stomach turned. The records detailed a series of experiments conducted on patients with severe mental disorders. The procedures described were brutal, involving invasive surgeries and psychological manipulations intended to treat conditions that were poorly understood at the time. The final entries in the journals were filled with frantic scribbles about patients who became increasingly unstable, their screams of anguish echoing through the corridors. The weight of the room seemed to press down on Michael, the air growing colder and denser. The whispers now formed coherent, chilling phrases, pleas for help, cries of pain, and accusations. Michael's flashlight flickered, and he could feel a presence growing stronger, almost as if it were watching him. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and he began to see his breath in the cold air. Suddenly, the operating table's restraints began to rattle, and shadows seemed to dance along the walls, forming grotesque shapes. Michael felt an overwhelming sense of despair and terror. The spirits of those who had suffered in this room seemed to manifest, their memories and pain intertwining with his own fear. He could almost see their distorted, anguished faces, their eyes pleading for release. As Michael tried to retreat, He realized that the door he had entered through was now firmly shut, as if held in place by an unseen force. Panic set in, and he turned back to the room, desperately searching for a way out. The shadows grew darker and more oppressive, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of angry voices. The spirits seemed to reach out to him, their anguish palpable. Michael understood with horrifying clarity that the entity in the room was not just a manifestation of the past, but an active, malevolent force that thrived on the suffering it had witnessed. The entity fed on the memories and pain of its victims, using them to manipulate and torment those who ventured too close. In his final moments, Michael could feel the presence closing in, its dark energy wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. The room seemed to contract, and the whispers became an overwhelming roar. The operating table began to vibrate violently, and Michael could feel the cold, spectral hands of the past reaching for him. His screams were drowned out by the tumultuous noise of the entity's rage. As the darkness consumed him, Michael's last thoughts were filled with the realization that he was now a part of the very horror he had sought to understand. The old hospital, with its haunted past, had claimed another victim, and the echoes of its tormented history would continue to reverberate through its decaying walls. In the heart of a sprawling, aging hospital in the United States, a team of dedicated doctors and nurses, Dr. Evelyn Carter, Dr. Ryan Mitchell, Nurse Sarah Jenkins, and Nurse Tom Harris, decided to explore an abandoned wing that had been closed off decades earlier. The wing, once a part of the hospital's cutting-edge psychiatric unit, had been sealed following a series of mysterious deaths and inexplicable incidents that left the hospital staff and patients deeply unsettled. The wing had remained a topic of eerie speculation and urban legend among the hospital staff. It was Dr. Carter who proposed the exploration, driven by an academic curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth behind the wing's dark history. The other team members, equally intrigued by the mystery and motivated by their own reasons, agreed to join her. They prepared themselves for the investigation, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of trepidation that was masked by a veneer of professional detachment. The corridor leading to the Forgotten Ward was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. The air grew colder as they approached, and the walls, once brightly painted, were now covered in a thick layer of grime and mold. The flickering fluorescent lights above cast erratic shadows that danced along the walls, heightening the sense of foreboding. The old metal door to the ward, rusted and heavy, groaned as Dr. Carter pushed it open. As the door creaked ajar, a wave of musty air enveloped them. The wing was eerily silent, the only sounds being their footsteps echoing off the bare walls and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. The team moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness to reveal old, neglected furniture, rusty gurneys, dusty chairs, and peeling wallpaper. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press in on them, each step they took resonating with a sense of history and dread. They began their investigation in what appeared to be the main treatment room. The room was filled with rusting medical equipment and strange apparatuses whose purposes were now lost to time. Old medical records and files lay scattered on a decrepit desk, their pages yellowed and brittle. As they sifted through the records, they were struck by the horrifying nature of the treatments documented. The files detailed a series of inhumane experiments conducted on patients with severe mental illnesses. The treatments were grotesque, involving physical restraints, invasive surgeries, and experimental drugs designed to alter the mind in ways that were not fully understood. Dr. Mitchell picked up a particularly disturbing file. It contained handwritten notes about a procedure known as neuroreconditioning, which described attempts to reprogram patients' neural pathways through painful stimuli. The notes became increasingly erratic and frantic, detailing how the patients, after enduring the procedures, would exhibit violent outbursts and hallucinations before ultimately succumbing to a mysterious fate. As they explored further, the team discovered a hidden room behind a sliding panel in the wall. Inside, they found what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory filled with old, dusty instruments and an old, decaying operating table. The walls of the room were lined with unsettling diagrams and cryptic symbols, the meanings of which were lost to the passage of time. The deeper they delved into the forgotten ward, the more the reality around them began to distort. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the temperature dropped drastically. Strange phenomena began to occur. Whispers floated through the corridors, disembodied voices seemed to speak directly to them, and shadows moved with a life of their own. The team began to experience vivid hallucinations, their senses overwhelmed by a disorienting blend of fear and confusion. Nurse Sarah Jenkins saw fleeting figures darting around the corners of her vision, their faces twisted in anguish. She could hear their muffled cries and felt a chilling presence that seemed to brush past her. Her flashlight flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows that appeared to close in on her. Nurse Tom Harris, who had always been a skeptic, began to question his own sanity as he witnessed objects in the room moving on their own. Books and files seemed to fly off the shelves, and the once still air now felt alive with a malevolent energy. His sense of reality began to crumble as he felt an icy hand gripping his shoulder, only to turn and find no one there. Dr. Carter and Dr. Mitchell tried to maintain their composure, but the mounting tension and fear were palpable. They attempted to document their findings, but their equipment malfunctioned unpredictably. Cameras captured distorted images, and recording devices emitted static and incoherent sounds. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, and they struggled to make sense of their experiences. As the hours passed, the team's sense of time and space began to fracture. The once familiar corridors of the hospital seemed to twist and elongate, leading them in circles. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of anguished voices that seemed to accuse and torment them. They realized that the wing was not just haunted, but seemed to be actively manipulating their perceptions. The final moments of their exploration were marked by sheer terror. The team found themselves in the main treatment room once again, but now it was filled with a dense, oppressive darkness. The operating table in the center of the room began to move on its own, and the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The voices reached a fever pitch, their cries becoming a relentless assault on the team's senses. In a desperate attempt to escape, the team scrambled to find the exit, but the door to the ward was now locked tight, as if sealed by an unseen force. Panic set in, and they could feel the oppressive presence closing in around them. The shadows in the room grew more intense, and the whispers transformed into a deafening roar. As the entity's presence reached its peak, the team was enveloped in darkness. The oppressive force seemed to crush them, and their cries for help were swallowed by the overwhelming noise. The last thing they saw before everything went black was a glimpse of distorted, anguished faces pressed against the walls, their expressions a haunting reminder of the ward's tragic past. The forgotten ward claimed its victims, leaving the hospital once more in silence. The abandoned wing remained a place of dread and sorrow, its dark history etched into the walls and the echoes of its tortured souls. The team's fate became another chapter in the hospital's dark lore, a grim reminder of the horrors that lurk beyond the veil of reality. In the quiet halls of the prestigious St. Augustine Hospital in the small town of Marlow, Nurse Emily Davis began her shift on a chilly autumn evening. Known for her dedication and compassion, Emily was assigned to care for a new patient, an elderly man named William Thompson, who had been admitted with a rare and terminal illness. The disease was so rare that it left the medical staff baffled and the prognosis grim. William was confined to a private room on the hospital's oldest wing, a section of the building with a somber history. The room was dimly lit by a single overhead light, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Emily had noticed something peculiar about the patient from the start. Despite his advanced age and deteriorating condition, William showed no signs of improvement or decline. His vitals remained alarmingly stable, as if he were suspended in a state of perpetual suffering. Emily's shifts with William were marked by an unsettling routine. He rarely spoke, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, and he would sometimes murmur incoherently. The air around him always seemed colder, and Emily often found herself shivering despite the room's constant temperature. The staff speculated about his condition, but no one could offer a clear explanation for his mysterious ailment. As days turned into weeks, Emily began to notice strange occurrences. The hospital's lights would flicker unpredictably when she entered William's room, and she would occasionally hear whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The whispers were barely audible, but carried a tone of sadness and desperation. Emily tried to ignore them, attributing them to the stress of her job and the isolation of the wing. One night, as Emily sat by William's bedside, she noticed a thick mist forming around him, curling up from the floor like smoke. It coiled around his bed, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The mist seemed to whisper William's name, and Emily could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. She felt an inexplicable sense of dread, as if the room itself were alive and watching her. Determined to understand what was happening, Emily began researching William's case more intensely. She scoured old medical records and hospital archives, but found only sparse information. It was as if the records had been intentionally kept vague. The more she delved into the history of the wing, the more she discovered unsettling details about the hospital's past. The wing had been the site of numerous unexplained deaths and disappearances, which had been quietly brushed aside or dismissed as coincidences. One evening, Emily came across a dusty old ledger hidden away in the archives. The ledger contained detailed notes about patients who had been treated in the wing decades earlier. The entries were written in a shaky, erratic hand, describing procedures and experiments that bordered on the macabre. One particular entry stood out. It spoke of a patient named William Thompson who had undergone a special treatment intended to extend life indefinitely. The treatment had been abruptly discontinued, and the patient was said to have vanished under mysterious circumstances. Emily's heart raced as she pieced together the information. William Thompson's name matched her patient's, and the ledger suggested that the patient was somehow trapped in a state between life and death. The more she read, the more she realized that the treatment had not been meant to cure, but to bind the patient's soul to the hospital, trapping him in a perpetual cycle of suffering. As Emily continued her research, the strange occurrences around William intensified. The whispers grew louder, and shadowy figures began to appear at the periphery of her vision. The once occasional flickering of lights became a constant, disorienting strobe. Objects in the room seemed to move on their own, and Emily felt a cold, spectral presence that seemed to follow her every step. One night, as Emily was alone with William, the room was enveloped in a thick, suffocating fog. The mist swirled around the bed, and Emily could barely see through it. William's face, though pallid and gaunt, now looked distorted, his eyes sunken and hollow, staring at her with an intensity that pierced her very soul. The whispers turned into anguished cries, and the temperature in the room dropped to a freezing chill. In a panic, Emily tried to leave the room, but the door was jammed shut. She could hear the sound of heavy breathing behind her, growing louder and more frantic. The mist coalesced into a shape that seemed to be reaching for her, its spectral form shifting and writhing with a grotesque energy. As Emily struggled to free the door, she felt an icy hand grasp her wrist, pulling her back toward the bed. The whispers became a deafening roar, and she felt as though she were being dragged into the fog. Her vision blurred, and she could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmarish illusions surrounding her. In a final, desperate act, Emily grabbed the old ledger she had found and hurled it at the mist. The ledger struck the spectral form, and for a moment, the mist seemed to recoil. But the respite was short-lived. The entity surged forward, engulfing Emily in its cold embrace. The room grew dark, and the cries of suffering seemed to engulf her, their intensity overwhelming. The next morning, the hospital staff found William's room empty. The bed was pristine, and there was no sign of Emily. The records of her disappearance were as vague as those of the patients before her. The wing remained closed, and the legend of the haunted ward continued to grow. The room was sealed once more, but the whispers of suffering remained. The hospital staff would occasionally report hearing faint cries and seeing fleeting shadows in the abandoned wing. The cycle of torment had claimed another victim, and the entity's presence continued to linger, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. At the edge of the quiet town of Meadowbrook stood the Elite Sleep Haven Clinic, a state-of-the-art facility specializing in the treatment of severe sleep disorders. The clinic had gained a reputation for pioneering research and innovative therapies, making it a beacon of hope for those suffering from chronic insomnia and other sleep-related conditions. Recently, Dr. Rachel Adams, a renowned sleep specialist, introduced a groundbreaking treatment designed to cure insomnia by manipulating the brain's sleep cycles. The treatment, known as SomniRestore, promised to reset the brain's natural rhythms and eliminate insomnia once and for all. The first group of patients to undergo the SomniRestore treatment was a diverse mix of individuals, each suffering from different forms of severe insomnia. Among them were James Walker, a businessman plagued by endless nights of sleeplessness; Lisa Reynolds, a young mother whose insomnia had driven her to the brink of exhaustion; and Harold Bennett, an elderly man whose insomnia had become a torturous existence. The treatment involved a series of advanced neurostimulation sessions, where patients were subjected to a complex regimen of brainwave manipulation while sleeping. Initially, the procedure seemed to be a success. Patients reported improved sleep patterns and a general sense of well-being. However, it soon became clear that something was amiss. James was the first to experience troubling side effects. After his initial sessions, he began to have vivid, nightmarish dreams. The dreams were so intense that he could feel the terror seeping into his waking life. He saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his home and felt an unshakable sense of dread following him throughout the day. The more he tried to dismiss the visions as mere dreams, the more they seemed to invade his reality. Lisa's symptoms followed a similar trajectory. Her dreams were filled with grotesque and nightmarish scenarios. Monsters with human faces, endless corridors that twisted into impossible shapes, and a constant feeling of being pursued. What terrified her most was the way these nightmares started to bleed into her waking hours. She would find herself in her kitchen, only to discover blood-stained countertops and broken dishes, remnants of her dreams manifesting in the real world. Harold, too, was plagued by increasingly disturbing dreams. His nights were filled with haunting images of his long-deceased wife, appearing to him in macabre, twisted forms. He could hear her voice calling him from the shadows, but when he would turn around, there was only darkness. Harold's waking moments became a blur as he struggled to differentiate between the horrifying dreamscapes and his daily life. As the days went by, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The patients began to report that their nightmares were not confined to the realm of sleep. Their dreams began to manifest in their surroundings in increasingly disturbing ways. Patients who had once found solace in the clinic's well-lit hallways now saw flickering lights and shadows moving with malicious intent. The staff noticed that the patients were becoming increasingly agitated, their behavior erratic and unstable. Dr. Adams, initially convinced that these symptoms were mere side effects of the treatment, began to investigate further. She reviewed the treatment protocols and patient reports, but everything seemed to be in order. The technology used in SomniRestore was cutting edge, and the procedures had been rigorously tested. Yet, as she delved deeper, she discovered something unsettling in the clinical notes, anomalies in the data that suggested the treatment might be triggering something far more sinister. One night, while conducting a routine check, Dr. Adams was startled to find James wandering the clinic's darkened hallways, his eyes wide and vacant. He mumbled incoherently about seeing figures that weren't there, his fear palpable. As she escorted him back to his room, she noticed a disturbing pattern. The shadows in the corners of her vision seemed to move, and the air grew colder. The line between sleep and reality began to blur for the entire clinic. The patient's nightmares grew more vivid and more invasive. Lisa's dreams were now filled with menacing figures that seemed to follow her every waking move. Harold's visions of his wife grew more horrifying, and he would often wake up to find his bed drenched in sweat, as though the nightmares had physically overwhelmed him. Dr. Adams herself began to experience disturbing phenomena. She would find strange symbols etched into her office furniture and hear whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The clinic's once sterile and controlled environment had become a breeding ground for paranoia and fear. The once orderly and pristine corridors now seemed to twist and shift, leading her to darkened rooms that had no place in the clinic's layout. Desperate to find answers, Dr. Adams turned to the clinic's head researcher, Dr. Mark Sullivan, who had helped develop SomniRestore. Together, they discovered unsettling records of previous trials and research that hinted at a troubling pattern. The treatment appeared to be tapping into something deep within the human psyche, an ancient and malevolent force that had been awakened by their experimental procedures. The entity, as they discovered, thrived on fear and suffering. It had been dormant, buried deep within the human subconscious, but the neurostimulation of Somnirestore had inadvertently unleashed it. The nightmares were not just random phantoms but manifestations of the entity's influence, preying on the deepest fears of those who had undergone the treatment. The clinic's once clinical and controlled environment had become a nightmarish labyrinth. The patients' dreams continued to invade their waking lives, and the clinic itself seemed to warp and twist, reflecting the collective terror of those trapped within. The boundaries between reality and nightmare were irreparably shattered, leaving the patients and staff in a state of constant dread. In the end, Dr. Adams and Dr. Sullivan could do little to reverse the damage. The clinic was shut down, but the nightmares persisted, leaving behind a legacy of terror. The patients who had once sought relief were left trapped in their own minds, forever haunted by the dreams that had become their reality. The Sleep Haven Clinic, once a beacon of hope, became a dark legend, a place where the darkest corners of the human psyche had been unleashed and where the line between sleep and reality had irrevocably dissolved. In the heart of the bustling city of Chicago stood the state-of-the-art facility known as Vanguard Medical Center, a beacon of advanced medical technology and innovation. The latest addition to its impressive roster of features was the Isolation Ward, a newly constructed wing designed to handle patients with highly contagious diseases. This ward was equipped with cutting-edge containment systems and was intended to be a fortress against outbreaks that could potentially wreak havoc on public health. The Isolation Ward was a marvel of modern engineering. It had its own air filtration system, pressure-controlled rooms, and biometric security to ensure that no pathogens could escape. Dr. Laura Mitchell, the head physician, oversaw the opening of the ward with great pride, confident in the technology's ability to keep everyone safe. On the day the ward opened, the staff were given an extensive briefing on the protocols. They were instructed on the rigorous hygiene practices, the emergency lockdown procedures, and the importance of maintaining strict quarantine measures. For the patients, the Isolation Ward was a haven of hope, offering a chance at recovery from otherwise untreatable diseases. Among the first patients admitted were Charles Green, a businessman suffering from a rare viral infection, Jennifer Hayes, a young woman with a highly contagious strain of tuberculosis, and Thomas Riley, an elderly man with a debilitating and infectious condition. At first, everything seemed to proceed as planned. The ward's state-of-the-art systems functioned flawlessly, and the patients appeared to be adapting to their new environment. However, it wasn't long before strange occurrences began to unsettle the staff. The first incident was minor but peculiar. An air pressure alarm went off in one of the containment rooms, only to resolve itself without explanation. As the days went by, the anomalies became more disturbing. Doors would lock and unlock on their own, and strange noises echoed through the sterile halls. The security cameras, meant to provide a sense of security, began to show fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving through the hallways. Initially, these were dismissed as glitches or the result of the high-stress environment, but the unsettling feeling among the staff grew. Dr. Laura Mitchell noticed that the staff's morale was deteriorating. Nurses and aides became increasingly paranoid, constantly checking and rechecking the security systems. They reported feeling as if they were being watched, and some even claimed to hear whispers in the empty corridors. The once pristine ward seemed to take on a life of its own, with the sterile white walls now seeming to pulse and breathe with an unsettling rhythm. One evening, as Dr. Mitchell conducted her rounds, she noticed a particularly disturbing development. The security cameras in one of the patient rooms were malfunctioning, showing static and occasional glimpses of what looked like a dark, shifting form. When she arrived to check on Charles Green, she found his room eerily quiet, the temperature inexplicably cold. Charles lay in his bed, his eyes wide open and filled with terror, but he was otherwise unresponsive. As the days turned into weeks, the situation worsened. Staff members began to disappear without a trace. The first was Nurse Emily Carter, who vanished during a routine check of the air filtration system. Her disappearance was chalked up to a tragic accident, but the staff's anxiety grew when her body was never found. Then came the disappearance of Dr. Samuel Hughes, a respected infectious disease specialist who had been working in the ward. His absence was even more alarming, as no trace of him could be found, and his belongings were left behind in a state of disarray. The remaining staff and patients were now engulfed in fear and paranoia. The once controlled environment of the isolation ward had become a breeding ground for dread. The remaining staff, including Dr. Mitchell, found themselves questioning their own sanity. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were being taunted by something unseen. As Dr. Mitchell reviewed the security footage, she saw something that defied logic. The shadows in the footage seemed to take on a tangible form, coalescing into a dark, indistinct figure that roamed the halls. The figure appeared to have a face, but it was shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intensity. The recording showed this entity seemingly manipulating the doors, turning off the lights, and even interacting with the patients in disturbing ways. Desperate to make sense of the chaos, Dr. Mitchell turned to the hospital's archives, hoping to uncover some clue that might explain the ward's sudden descent into madness. She discovered old records about a previous, failed experiment conducted in the very same location decades earlier. The records hinted at the involvement of a secretive government project that had been abandoned after reports of disturbing and unexplained phenomena. The experiments were rumored to have involved mind-altering technologies and dark psychological manipulations. The realization dawned on Dr. Mitchell that the isolation ward was built on a site tainted by these earlier experiments. The dark force that had haunted the ward was not merely a figment of the patients' imaginations, but a malevolent presence awakened by the technological advancements intended to contain it. The ward had become a conduit for this entity, which thrived on fear and suffering. As the remaining staff attempted to flee, they found themselves trapped. The ward's containment systems seemed to have malfunctioned, sealing the doors and locking the windows. The corridors twisted and changed, leading them in endless loops, and the shadows grew darker, more menacing. The entity's whispers turned into guttural roars, echoing through the halls and driving the survivors to the brink of madness. Dr. Mitchell's final moments were a blur of terror and hopelessness. The entity, now fully manifesting its presence, moved through the ward with a hunger for the fear it had cultivated. The survivors were ensnared in a nightmarish labyrinth, their every attempt to escape thwarted by the sinister force that had claimed the isolation ward as its own. In the aftermath, Vanguard Medical Center was abandoned, its isolation ward left to decay. The stories of the staff and patients who vanished became urban legends, tales whispered among the locals about the haunted hospital where reality itself seemed to unravel. The ward remained a dark testament to the dangers of tampering with forces beyond human understanding, a place where the line between the physical world and the shadows of the mind had irrevocably blurred.